All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks again so much to everyone for being here. This is training for Changemakers on immigration detention. So we'll go to the first slide to just explain some instructions for everyone. If anybody needs Spanish interpretation, we do have that available. So pueden acceder la interpretación en español haciendo clic en Interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionando Spanish. We also have closed captions that can be viewed by clicking on closed caption at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to turn that on if you would like. So we'll just give folks a moment in case they're interested in turning on any of those features. Perfect. So we'll go to the next slide. So we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're joining tonight's Zoom event from different places, but wherever that is, you are on occupied stolen land. I'm joining you all from Yokut's land in what is also known as Fresno, and we encourage you to identify whose land you are on, and you can look that up at native-land.ca, and there's a link there in the chat as well. So not only do we seek to recognize that this land does not belong to us, but we also recognize that Indigenous people are still here, active in our shared communities, advocating for justice, equality, and fairness for all peoples and our Earth. California is home to more Indigenous people than any other state, and there are currently 109 federally recognized tribes and 78 that are still in the position of petitioning the government to be recognized. So this art is by Jackie Fawn, who illustrated the vast beauty and rich culture of native California, from the ancient redwood giants to the concrete towers of the city. California, as the rest of the country, will always be native land, and it is important to honor and recognize the land we stand upon. This illustration is of a woman standing strong with the medicines our ancestors prayed with, a two-spirit youth holding the drum and songs of our ancestors, and wearing red for our murdered and missing Indigenous peoples, and of an elder that has carried the knowledge for our ancestors for us to carry into future generations. So we'll go to the next slide, and we're just going to start with a quick round of introductions for the speakers for tonight. So I'm Luis Ojeda, my pronouns are he, him. I'm the Regional Organizing and Program Manager, and I'm based out of our Fresno office. And I'll turn it to Ashley.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Ashley Morris. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Organizing Director, and I'm based out of the San Francisco office. I also want to mention that on Monday, we're observing Indigenous Peoples Day. Sana?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sana Singh. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the new Immigrants' Rights Fellow at the ACLU of Northern California, and I'm so excited to be here and have the chance to speak with you today.
Awesome. And if you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat as well with your name, your pronouns, city, and feel free to share one word to describe how you are feeling tonight. Great. I see some of you have already done that, so welcome again, everyone. So we'll go to the next slide, which will review the agenda for this evening. So we're going to get started first by doing a quick background on immigration detention. Then we'll move to talking about the executive branch, followed by talking about congressional power, and then end with a call to action, which we hope everyone will be interested in participating in. So again, that's what we have up on the agenda for this evening. And so we're going to start off first with the background of immigration detention, and I'll turn it over to Sana.
Emily, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to start this presentation with some background on immigration detention in California, which is particularly important because a lot of people think of California as a sanctuary state, but there are actually a lot of atrocities being committed in immigration detention facilities across the state daily, and we need to really confront that. And so to begin the conversation, I'd like to start with this short video. Emily, if you could start the video, thank you.
This past year has been just awful, right?
But in the midst of this horrible pandemic, something truly remarkable happened.
Last year, conditions at immigrant detention centers, or you can call them jails, because
that is exactly what they are became so dangerous that doctors from the Department of Homeland Security called them tinderboxes for COVID-19.
So detained immigrants brought the department to court.
Well, they won. Thousands of people awaiting their hearings were released.
And you know what happened? Instead of suffering in isolation, they were able to go home to their loved ones and their communities. And when it came time to appear in court, pretty much every single person showed up. Are you surprised?
I'm not. You know why? Because this is actually the way things used to be. Back in the day, crossing the border without legal authorization or overstaying a visa wasn't dealt with through detention.
Instead, it was typically treated as a civil offense, where people remained free while they waited for their day in court. So as recently as the 80s, instead of 50,000 immigrants in detention at any given day, we had closer to 2,000. But just in the past few years, more than 40 new immigration detention centers have opened up, feeding into a sprawling for-profit prison system that continues to grow. This past year has been just awful, right?
How I could catch COVID-19.
More than 40 new immigration detention centers have opened up, feeding into a sprawling for-profit prison system that continues to grow.
I was born in a Cambodian refugee camp, and I came here as a toddler at the age of 4. So the United States is the only home I ever known. And ICE came and picked me up. They came and detained me. It was just scary just thinking about how I could catch COVID-19. People was getting sick in the detention center, and they were passing away. So it was terrifying.
Que no nos daban incluso higiene en cuanto a la parte de cubrebocas. Solamente veías el cielo una vez en el día.
Sheriffs walk in every hour on the hour, yelling. They do everything possible to break you down mentally, spiritually, emotionally, at times physically.
But Fox, it doesn't have to be this way.
Under our current laws, we could release tens of thousands of people from detention centers right now.
Ahora que estoy libre, que mis hijos y yo sentimos, al estar juntos, nos abrazamos, andamos para arriba y para abajo, cosa que tal vez pensé que nunca los iba a poder volver a hacer con ellos.
I've been offered a union job. Life is good.
It's a gift from God. I'm involved with community outreach, and I participate in the food giveaway drive, and I'm full of gratitude because I have this purpose in life now. And on top of that, I have my family.
A pesar de tanto sufrimiento, ahora viene la felicidad.
It's time to fulfill the promise of a country where everyone is entitled to basic human rights and due process under the law.
We can dismantle the immigration detention machine.
We can end contracts with private for-profit prisons, and we can share compassion with immigrant and refugee families who, like all Americans,
seek and deserve a better life.
So that video we all just watched demonstrates a key principle that is the foundation of our work. Immigration detention is inhumane, it is needlessly cruel, and it is completely unnecessary. And it is particularly important that we in California recognize this because we're home to so many of this nation's immigrants. In fact, more than a quarter of California residents are immigrants, and over 2 million US citizens in California live with at least one family member who is undocumented. So this issue isn't about non-citizens versus citizens. It is about the entire California community, and we are all implicated. And in this state that gains so much from the presence of immigrants, we have 8 immigration detention facilities, and they are not some relics of the past or some holdover from when California wasn't as progressive or liberal. Several of these facilities are new. In fact, between February 2019 and January 2021, the total immigration detention bed capacity in California increased from approximately 4,160 to 7,408. Now, as always, we have to keep in mind that immigration detention is civil detention. It is not intended to be a punishment for a criminal conviction, even though the conditions in immigration detention facilities are often as bad or worse than you would find in a prison. ICE detention exists purely to supposedly ensure that people who are in immigration proceedings show up to their court dates. But as the video we just watched indicated, it is not at all necessary to make sure that people show up. They will do so on their own. If you look closely at this map on the slide, you'll notice that many of these detention centers are in rural or remote parts of the state. So not only have we nearly doubled the immigration detention capacity in this state, we've done so in remote locations with compromised access to legal counsel and external medical care. This combination of factors makes it that much easier for immigration enforcement officials and detention officers to violate the civil rights and liberties of the people detained at these centers. For example, as many of you know, that while people are entitled to legal representation when they're in criminal proceedings, they are not entitled to a lawyer in immigration proceedings, despite it having similarly major implications for the outcome of their case and ultimately their lives. Detained immigrants are 11 times more likely to pursue relief when they have legal counsel and are twice as likely to obtain relief than detained immigrants without counsel. By placing these detention centers in remote locations away from legal counsel, we significantly reduce the chances that non-citizens win their cases and are released from immigration detention. Next slide, please. So out of the 8 immigration detention facilities in California, 7 are run through contracts with private for-profit companies. In fact, privately run facilities account for 97% of the total bed capacity at immigration detention facilities. Over the past year or so, there's been a national conversation about the problems with private prisons. Many of the same critiques of private prisons can be made about private immigration detention facilities. The root of the problem is that these companies have financial incentives to lock up as many people in detention facilities as possible. And this profit motive also helps explain why the medical care, food, and accommodations for detained people are so completely inadequate. These companies receive a certain amount of money per person, which leads to a negative financial incentive to provide good care. So that's why we hear routinely stories of people with cancer being given ibuprofen, for example, or people having to go to court to access soap during a pandemic. It is especially important that we start conversations about the horrors of privately run immigration detention facilities on a federal level at this particular moment. In January 2021, President Biden issued an executive order directing the Department of Justice to phase out its contracts with private prison companies. The executive order instructed the DOJ not to renew contracts with privately operated criminal detention facilities, but the executive order did not apply to ICE detention facilities. So as private prison corporations have found themselves with empty beds to fill, they've found a new source of income: detained immigrants. GEO Group, which operates most of the private immigration detention facilities in California, benefits immensely from this arrangement. 28% of GEO's revenue came from ICE detention contracts in both 2019 and 2020, at a total of $708 million in 2019 and $662 million in 2020. And each dollar in the pockets of GEO Group from these contracts comes at the expense of immigrants and their families. According to the most recent data, this month there are over 1,100 people in immigration detention throughout the state of California. Who are they? They are predominantly young people with families and strong community ties. A California Department of Justice report found that the average age of a person in immigration detention in this state is between the ages of 30 and 33. However, California immigration detention facilities house people as young as 17 and as old as 82. So we're ripping apart families and communities. In California, people end up in immigration detention largely in 3 ways. 1, if they're crossing the border and are apprehended. 2, if they're applying for some sort of USCIS benefit and are found to be ineligible and their immigration status is flagged. And 3, if they're transferred due to local law enforcement cooperation with ICE. Local law enforcement cooperation is far and away the way that most people end up in immigration custody in California. Most often, it is county jails that notify ICE of a person of interest in their custody, and immigration enforcement comes to pick them up when they're due to be released. Again, not all of these people have even been convicted of any crime. And even if they do have a conviction, it's important to keep in mind that immigrants who committed a crime serve criminal sentences in prisons and jails just like US citizens do. Once they have served that time, they should be released just as US citizens are. Instead, many serve a double punishment, facing detention and deportation after they've already served their criminal sentence. In some instances, people are locked up in immigration detention even longer than their initial criminal sentence. And again, it does not have to be this way. Immigration detention rips tens of thousands of people away from their families and their communities, including longtime residents who are our neighbors, coworkers, and family members. This country has not always spent taxpayer money to lock up immigrants. Until the 1980s, when the private prison profiteers began to flourish, immigrants were free while they navigated the legal process. The immigrant detention system is marred by the rampant abuse, neglect, and degradation of detained people. In many ways, the detention system mirrors the growth of our mass incarceration crisis. The same machinery that leads to the over-policing and disproportionate sentencing of Black and Brown people in a criminal context has led to growth in the immigration context as well. So now jails and prisons that emptied out due to criminal justice reform have turned into detention facilities. The same energy we bring to criminal justice reform needs to be brought to ending immigration detention. Next slide, please. So as the video discussed, the ACLU affiliates in California have been involved in class action litigation to get people released from immigration detention facilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fiscal year 2020 was the deadliest year in ICE detention in 15 years. Last year alone, we saw reports of increased use of force, solitary confinement, patterns of sexual abuse, forced sterilization, and a complete failure to protect people from COVID-19. These 3 lawsuits were brought to challenge the conditions at different detention centers across the state. As we all know, the CDC recommended maintaining 6 feet of distance from others and regular hand washing to control the spread of COVID-19. For people in immigration detention facilities, taking such precautions was impossible. In detention facilities, people were forced to sleep within inches of one another in overcrowded dorms. One detained individual with medical vulnerabilities said that they had to keep working to clean out the barracks because they were paid $1 a day to do so, and that money was the only way that they could afford to buy the $3 soap from the commissary to try and practice good hygiene to avoid contracting COVID-19. Despite the dangers...
Can we just pause real quick?
Yes.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
You can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Despite the dangers of COVID-19, ICE officials continued to bring in new people daily, including transfers from other facilities that had active COVID-19 outbreaks. They also continued to refuse to release, test, or quarantine individuals who were exhibiting symptoms, and they did not provide people in detention with adequate protective gear. These lawsuits were brought as a way to compel ICE to use their discretion to release people and to implement adequate health procedures. And this litigation truly demonstrated that left to their own devices, immigration enforcement will never do the right or humane thing. Instead, litigation and advocates and constant watchfulness is needed to make sure that the people in immigration detention are not abused at the hands of immigration enforcement officials. So while COVID-19 brought to light how deplorable immigration detention conditions are for the broader public, many of us here today are familiar with these patterns of cruelty, and our affiliate has brought other litigation to challenge immigration detention conditions even prior to the pandemic. And I'm happy to discuss that during our Q&A session or at another time offline. Again, I just want to reiterate, it does not have to be this way. The data shows that most undocumented people show up for court. Detention is not necessary, nor is it a humane or acceptable response. We do not jail everybody who is awaiting court dates in the criminal legal system because it is a clear violation of their civil liberties, and our Constitution protects against that. So that same logic should apply to our immigration system. We can build a system that supports immigrants and the government's interests without the cost and abuses that are part of this fundamentally flawed system. And with that, I will turn it over to Luis.
Thank you so much. So yeah, there was a comment in the chat about California laws. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the progress that California has made. So in recent years, California has passed lots of pro-immigrant legislation, like the Truth Act in 2016, which expanded the rights of immigrants in local custody and required jurisdictions to hold community forums to highlight collaboration with ICE. And also the California Values Act in 2017, which limited the use of state and local resources for immigration enforcement and protected many immigrants from being transferred to ICE. And many of you on the call may have worked on these pieces of legislation as well. But we definitely want to highlight that a lot of these pieces of legislation either didn't go far enough or weren't as strong as it could have been due to other limitations. And so while, Alice, there are some of these protections that are in place because of these laws, it definitely hasn't done everything possible to protect immigrants. Another bill, the Vision Act, was introduced this year and would also expand protections for immigrants in local and state custody by prohibiting them from being transferred to ICE if they've already been deemed eligible for release. The bill passed the Assembly and is continuing through the process in the State Senate next year. So definitely stay tuned for more about that bill as well. And then lastly, another bill that we wanted to share, one that passed in 2019, the California legislature passed AB 32, which sought to ban the use of privately operated prisons and immigration detention facilities, but is currently being litigated in the courts. And Sana, did you want to share anything about that bill as well?
Yes, absolutely. So there was actually a recent decision, actually just 2 days ago, that has halted the implementation of AB 32. When AB 32 went into effect, the Trump administration and GEO Group, which I talked about, brought a lawsuit to stop the implementation of it. GEO Group asserted that they would lose $4 billion in capital investment and future earnings should the law go into effect. And the judge that made this decision ruled that the federal government has broad discretion over immigrant detention, including the right to contract with private companies to operate these detention facilities. Immigrant advocates are quite upset, understandably, about this ruling. The ruling misstates a lot of basic facts about the immigration detention landscape in California, and a lot of the legal reasoning was just based on facts that are just completely not true. And so this is not the end of it. We are hopeful that the Attorney General will continue to push this forward, and that AB 32 will eventually be implemented.
Thank you for sharing that. And so we end by just, again, highlighting all these pieces of legislation that we tried to move through the California State Legislature, but to highlight, again, the fact that there just needs to be more work that we need to do. So while there are steps that we can take at the state level, it's really important for us to look elsewhere to handle some of these important issues around immigration detention. So we'll turn to the next slides. Which is going to be a discussion on executive branch power. So we'll go to the next slide. So we want to begin by just talking kind of around where things are at the federal level. So I'm sure folks are watching the news and hearing all the different discussions that are happening around immigration reform and those kinds of conversations. So we just wanted to kind of touch a little bit about what's happening at the federal level. So last year, President Biden often shared criticism of Trump's immigration policies, saying things like, Trump has waged an unrelenting assault on our values and our history as a nation of immigrants. It's wrong, and it stops when Joe Biden is elected president. But almost 9 months later, there is so much more that the Biden administration could be doing to support immigrants. The fact is that being better on immigration than Trump is a very low bar. The Biden administration has continued to use the pandemic as an excuse to prevent migrants who are seeking asylum to enter the country through Title 42, and this has meant that deportations have continued, including that of thousands of Haitian migrants, most recently in the news. Additionally, ICE and Customs and Border Protection budgets have continued at record levels, allowing these agencies to continue terrorizing communities and targeting immigrants. Lastly, there appears to be little hope for citizenship legislation in Congress, leaving millions of people longing for relief. So this is a time for bold action, and we must push the Biden administration, to act. And we'll tell you a little bit more about how we can make that happen. And I'll turn it over to Ashley.
So ultimately what we want to do is shut down this immigration detention machine, which, as you saw from the video and as you heard from Sana, is inherently cruel and unnecessary. Our primary target, so the person who has the power to give us what we want, make that change, is Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is part of the executive branch of the federal government. So that means that the President Biden, nominated, and then the Senate confirmed the Secretary of the Department. And he's also a member of the Cabinet, which is a really important group of people in the federal government. Political appointees in these types of very high-level positions have very close relationships to the president, and they're expected to essentially carry out the president's agenda related to the department that they oversee. So that's all to say that Secretary Mayorkas is an extremely important person in the federal government, and he holds a lot of power. Next slide. As Sana mentioned, across the United States, there are some detention facilities that are owned and operated by ICE, some that are owned and operated by state and local governments, and some that are owned and operated by private contractors. In California, we have a government-operated facility in Yuba County. The Yuba County Jail is also an ICE detention facility, and then the others are all operated by private contractors. In order for these either local governments or private contractors to actually operate immigration facilities, because they're not the federal government, and the federal government is the branch of government that's responsible for immigration enforcement, ICE has to enter into contracts with these facility operators, obviously. To contract with a county government or a state government, ICE enters into what is called an Intergovernmental Service Agreement, or IGSA. And then similarly, ICE has to enter into a contract, it doesn't have a fancy name, with any private contractor like GEO that is going to operate a detention facility and basically do the job of immigration enforcement for the federal government. Secretary Mayorkas has the authority to pull out of the Intergovernmental Service Agreement, or the IGSA, with Yuba County, and he can also find a way to end or to not renew the contracts with the private contractors that are operating the other facilities in California. Of course, those contracts can also be ended from the other end. Yuba County could pull out of the IGSA, or the private contractors could end their contracts, but obviously, especially the private contractors are making a lot of money from these contracts, so there's not much incentive, and the private contractors are in no way accountable to the general public. They're not elected like the president is, so it's a lot harder to get those contracts ended from the other side. So this is what makes Secretary Mayorkas the key decision maker and the primary target for this effort to close detention facilities and dramatically reduce the number of people who are in immigration detention. But as we'll talk about next, we're not going to directly target Secretary Mayorkas. There are, I think there's a petition or something on the ACLU national website where you can, sign a petition to Secretary Mayorkas. But we're going to instead today take a look at Congress and how they can exercise their checks and balances on the federal branch as the secondary targets for this effort. You can go to the next slide, Emily. So there are some important committees that I first want to mention before we talk about what we're actually going to ask you to do. So we hear people talk about congressional committees and caucuses all the time, but congressional committees are delegated responsibility to review and analyze policy before it goes to the House floor for debate or for a vote. And then they also have some oversight and investigative responsibilities that are delegated to them to oversee and look at other aspects of the federal government. Caucuses don't really have specific procedural responsibilities in the same way that committees do, but they're instead groups of members of Congress who have some sort of shared interest, who come together to find a way to advance those shared interests that they have. So I'm not going to go too much into the caucuses here, but two major caucuses that have an interest in immigration reform, immigrants' rights, are the Progressive Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus. So when you meet with or sign up to make a call to your member of Congress, spoiler alert, that's what we're going to ask you to do, we'll let you know if they're on the Progressive Caucus or if they're on the Hispanic Caucus, because It's helpful when members of a caucus are like really engaged in an issue, because they can get their caucus to prioritize the issue or do more research into it or bring together experts. So we want to make sure that you know if the person that you're meeting with or calling is a member of one of these caucuses that has a particular interest that we know of in immigration. So committees, like I said, have specific responsibility and authority as far as how Congress functions. So I'm going to talk about a couple of key committees that touch on immigration frequently. So the first one is the House Committee on the Judiciary. They're responsible for looking at issues that impact civil liberties in the Constitution, and then they're also responsible for oversight of the Department of Homeland Security, which, reminder, Alejandro Mayorkas is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So Judiciary has direct oversight responsibility over Homeland Security. So that's a really important committee. Usually it sends the most substantive, like the highest number of substantive policy bills to the floor of Congress each year. So they're a very busy committee as well. Zoe Lofgren, who's from like the Peninsula South Bay area, is the chair of the subcommittee on immigration and citizenship. So she oversees the proceedings of that subcommittee as it reviews any proposed legislation related to immigration or immigration reform or enforcement. So she's really seen as influential and an expert voice in Congress on immigration issues. Tom McClintock, who's from sort of like, I think, the more northern part of the Central Valley area, is the ranking member on that subcommittee, which means that he's the lead Republican, because the Democrats have power in Congress right now. They have the majority, barely. So it'll be a Democrat who chairs committees, and then a Republican will be the ranking member. So Tom McClintock is the ranking member of the subcommittee on immigration and citizenship, but he's not really a key target of ours because he's not likely at all to come on board with our ask to close detention facilities. But if you do live in his district, you can still definitely reach out to him, meet with him. So again, he has expertise on this issue from probably quite a different perspective than we do. And he's someone who's looked to within the Republican Party on immigration issues. The Appropriations Committee is responsible for writing the bills that actually fund the federal government, including DHS and ICE and any other federal government agency. So they make decisions about how many dollars to appropriate to things like border security and surveillance and other immigration enforcement activities, including detention. Key members from Northern California include Barbara Lee from Oakland and Josh Harder, who is from the Modesto area. When I say they make decisions, obviously they don't make the final decision, but they have influence over the content that goes into the bill before it goes to the floor of Congress, again, for debate and a vote. And then finally, I want to talk about the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, which is usually referred to as the House Oversight Committee. They have broad investigative authority. They have jurisdiction to investigate, hold hearings on any topic that's under their legislative purview, which is quite broad, as well as authority to investigate any topic that's under the jurisdiction of any other standing House committee. So basically, they can investigate anything over which the US Congress has jurisdiction. So super, super broad oversight authority for this committee. There is a subcommittee of the Oversight Committee, a subcommittee on national security that has oversight over Homeland Security and immigration. And both Mark DeSaulnier, who's from Contra Costa County area, and Jackie Spear, who's also from the Peninsula South Bay area, sit on that committee. And then Ro Khanna, who's also from the South Bay, is on the Oversight Committee, but he doesn't sit on that National Security Subcommittee. So the members that I've mentioned here are some key members of Congress who have powerful committee assignments, coveted committee assignments, and they have other authority to influence the direction of immigration policy more broadly, and also to influence Secretary Mayorkas to make decisions that result in fewer people in immigration detention. And of course, I can't talk about Congress without mentioning House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who, as you all know, is from San Francisco. And she's not only the leader of the US House of Representatives, but she's also one of the most powerful people in politics, especially in Democratic politics in the country. So she has a lot of power and influence over other important people and direct access to people like Alejandro Mayorkas. This is a picture I took last time I was in Washington, D.C. of the Capitol building. So why are we targeting Congress, and why are we considering them a secondary target? And I should just back up for 1 second, because I'm already making myself mad with using the improper terminology. A target is never a group of people. A target is an individual person. You can have multiple individual targets, but you can't say that your target is Congress. So I'm being a little loose with proper organizing terminology here, but basically we're saying that every individual member of Congress can be a target for this. We can get them on board with closing detention facilities and get them to influence Alejandro Mayorkas to close detention facilities. So congressional committees can, like I said earlier, hold hearings to investigate things like detention conditions or how agencies are being managed. They can call on Secretary Mayorkas to testify about decisions he's made about how to administer the Department of Homeland Security or how ICE is being run. Hearings are also an important way that committees have the opportunity to sort of give the agency guidance on how the committee believes an agency should carry out its function. So if you've ever watched one of these hearings on C-SPAN, you'll see them asking questions, but you can tell that the committee members also have an agenda and they have an opinion. They're not coming in as neutral parties just to ask a cabinet member what's going on in their department. They're advocating for a position through the questions that they're asking often as well. And then committees can also directly investigate the actions of an agency. For example, last year, the House Oversight Committee actually sent staff of the committee to investigate reports of inadequate medical care in detention facilities. And later the committee released a report attesting to these dire conditions in these facilities. So there are a number of important roles that members of Congress and Congress as a whole can play in oversight of the federal government, of government agencies, and of cabinet members. And so that's why we today are going to be asking you to meet with or speak with your member of Congress to get them to exert their influence over Secretary Mayorkas. And we'll hand it back to Luis.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So yes, now we get to the part where we want to ask you all to take action in our call to action. So we'll go to the next slide. So we're going to be a bit cryptic, so we ask you to bear with us, but there is a letter that's being put together that's going to be sent to the Secretary of DHS, Alejandro Mayorkas, in the coming weeks. And so what we need your help with is getting members of Congress to sign on to this letter. We think that it would be a very powerful statement if if all members of Congress from California were to sign on and to show, right, that in California, we believe in the closure of these facilities. So while some members of Congress will be eager to sign on, so some of the members that Ashley discussed, right, some of them may be champions, and it might be really easy for them to decide to support this effort. There are definitely going to be others who are going to require more convincing. So we know that closing down immigration detention facilities in California would have a huge ripple effect and send a powerful message of support to our immigrant communities. So we'll move to the next slide. And so we're going to be sharing a link with everyone. It's a link to a form where you're going to be able to sign up to engage with your member of Congress. And we'd love to see everyone take action with us. We're going to follow up next week to everyone who signs up, to connecting them with others in your congressional district in order to be able to coordinate efforts and provide you with the resources you need to have effective meetings and conversations with your member of Congress. Remember, your representative works for you and needs to hear from you directly why we need to close these cruel and unnecessary detention facilities. The more people we get to participate in these meetings, and the more pressure we put on them, the more likely they're going to be able to support our efforts. So Ashley has put that link into the chat. And again, we'd love everyone to fill out that form. Let us know what who your representative is. And again, we'll then coordinate with everybody who signs up and give you the information that you need in order to be able to do the next steps. So who's excited? Who's ready to take action? Anyone ready? We've got some celebratory signs and emojis. Great. Awesome. Perfect. So again, we're not asking to call anyone just yet. We just kind of want to get everyone's to sign up, see who's interested and committed. And yes, definitely encouraging your friends, family, and loved ones to sign up as well. The more people we get to participate in this activity, in this action, the more likely, again, we'll be able to get more names on that letter. So with that, we're going to go to the next slide, which is going to be questions, to see if anybody has any questions about this call to action or any other components of our presentation tonight. Great, looks like Shauna is signing up right now. We love the enthusiasm. Is that Cricket Jane Doyle? So you have your hand up?
Yes, you haven't mentioned the Senate at all in this, and I'm wondering what, if any, role they play relative to what were this letter and related actions.
It's a great question. Would anyone like to take that?
The Senate is also very important, obviously. I might put Maria on the spot and you can answer in the chat. Maria, will we be asking senators to sign on to this or just House members?
Yeah, so as soon as this letter goes live, I'm actually going to reach out to, we're going to have a call with the member who's drafting it on Tuesday, and just ask them if it's okay for us to try to lobby the two senators to sign on, and if they think that's proper, then I think we should do that. I don't think we can't see them not wanting those signatures. Yeah, but we can keep folks posted.
Thanks, Maria. And Maria is one of our immigrants' rights attorneys who leads a lot of our policy work on both the state and federal level. So thanks, Maria.
We have a question in the chat as well. Now that we have a new president, what is holding up the process of closing these prisons? It's a great question, and I think we're going to make a very strong case in this letter, and we're going to hopefully get a ton of members of Congress to sign this letter to make that case directly to the administration, and hopefully it will be a strong case and they'll be willing to work with us to make this happen. Alice, I see your hand is also up.
Yes, I'm in the walkway, so I'm sorry it's going to be loud. But my question is, this is perfect for People Power. People Power went out and worked on the immigration problems at the airports, and they had hundreds of people in the Bay Area anyway, who showed up who were either active ACLUers or not ACLUers. This would be a perfect activity for People Power.
Thanks for the tip. Any other questions? Feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat.
Someone sent me a logistics question directly in the chat. We will send this link out to everyone in a follow-up email. So you all registered for this webinar. Hopefully you didn't put in a fake email address. If you did, you won't get our follow-up email. But we'll send you a PDF of the slides, and then the recording will be available at aclunc.org/BeTheChange. And we will also have information about, or we'll have the link to the form as well. So you can expect to hear from us. So our office is closed tomorrow and Monday in observance of Indigenous Peoples Day. So we'll be back in the office on Tuesday. So probably Tuesday, Wednesday, you can expect to hear from us with some follow-up. We would love if you could fill out the form by Wednesday-ish, because we want to quickly be able to connect you with other constituents from your district. That is the best way for us to keep this moving, and we'll probably be on a tight-ish timeline for getting sign-ons to this letter once it's launched. So yeah, if you could fill out that form as soon as possible, maybe don't wait for the follow-up email to fill it out. That way, promptly next week, we can connect you with other folks from your district. There's a question in the chat about the lobby visits, whether they're in Sacramento or the local office. So we're talking about the US Congress. So their offices are either in their district or in Washington, DC. They don't have offices in Sacramento unless they represent Sacramento, but the meetings will be virtual over Zoom. They're not really, for the most part, doing constituent meetings in person yet. So it'll be Zoom, it'll be easy. And we will give you instructions on how to set up the meetings yourselves. We'll be available to help with that, but we're really asking you as constituents of these members of Congress to work together to get meetings scheduled. And we're gonna give you all the tools that you need to do that successfully.
Great. Any other questions, Cricket? I see you have your hand up.
Yes. I'm wondering when the representative is not in the office, when that person is in Washington, D.C., what advice do you have about talking with staff? I mean, frankly, often when I call one of those offices, I'm just saying I support this bill or I'm opposed to this bill or something. I rarely have conversations. So maybe I feel like, how do you actually get into a conversation with somebody, A, and is it enough to call and say, we want you to support this letter that has just been received or whatever? I mean, some thoughts about techniques that you know that work or maybe carry a little more weight than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Oftentimes it's important to remember that you probably aren't going to be speaking directly with your representative, right? It most likely will be staff, but the staff communicate with the representative regularly, and so they'll be able to transmit any information that we give them directly with them. And then I think the other thing to remember is that, again, you're a constituent of theirs. They work for you, and so I think it's really important for you to highlight why you care about this issue, the fact that you're a constituent, and why you want them to take the action that we're asking them to take. And it also is going to require a lot of persistent communication with them, right? So it may be a meeting, there may be calls that we do to their offices after, there may be other ways that we can continue to pressure them, but each member of Congress is going to be a little bit different and may be persuaded a little bit differently depending on who they are. But Ashley, feel free to add anything as well.
Yeah, I'll just add that they really do tally up those calls on a bill or on requests to sign on to a letter. So that itself can have a lot of impact, just calling and saying that you're a constituent and that you want them to sign on to the letter. That will be tracked and reported to the member or to the staff member who works on that issue. And secondly, the staff members sometimes have more expertise on a particular issue because they are focused on that issue all the time than the member of Congress who's looking at a lot of different issues and developing a higher level of expertise in many issues. So often a staff member is a really valuable person to have a conversation with. And yeah, when you call an office, it's usually a receptionist or maybe an intern who answers the phone. So they're keeping track, they're taking your tally, but they may not have the substantive knowledge to really engage in a conversation. So that's when you do want to actually have a deeper conversation about a topic, that's when you really do need to request a meeting. Sometimes you can see if the person who works on that issue is available to talk and they'll put them on, but I haven't seen that happen in many cases. Usually you do need to actually schedule the meeting.
A follow-up to that is, I know from other things that sometimes, well, you just kind of referred to, asking for the person who's working on that issue. But as you know, as you find out, as you're working on this, or I'm sure you already know, who in an office is the person doing it, is there any way in the stuff that you're telling us, for example, okay, when you call this office, here are the two best people to ask for, or anything that can come to us apropos of a particular district?
Yeah, we'll give you that.
Okay,
We'll-
thank you.
We have a question in the chat. How will closing down facilities affect people being basically jailed for pending immigration proceedings? Won't they just get somewhere else? I'll say something and then others should add as well here, but basically we want people to be released. And so they would just be waiting in their community for their immigration proceedings and hearings to happen. So they shouldn't be sent somewhere else.
Sana, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure thing. So there are alternatives to detention. Some of that obviously being released is one of them. And like we talked about, the data shows that just purely releasing people back into their communities, they will still show up. But other alternatives include there are like family supervision type of programs where people are assigned essentially kind of like a social worker who helps keep the family of the immigrant apprised of what's going on and make sure that they arrive to their court dates. I'm not quite sure, Shauna, if I understand your fault. What do you mean by what will put pressure to get them released? Like, can you explain that? I guess if your question is, how are we going to pressure? Okay, I'm understanding. Okay, so I think the point that we're trying to make here is that immigration detention is fundamentally inhumane, and keeping any people in these facilities is inhumane, right? So that is what the pressure is, to get people released and to get these facilities shut down, right? And one of the things that I didn't really touch on a ton while I was talking earlier is that we already have, like I said, that there is a 7,408 bed immigration detention capacity in California. And yet at this moment, there are only 1,100 people detained, right? So we already are demonstrating that these facilities are not useful, and there's no point in trying to fill them up to try and meet these bed requirements. The point is that we have these beds, we're just paying these for-profit companies these bed minimums, and that there is no point in detaining people. So once people get released, then we can also pressure that these facilities are just a complete waste of taxpayer dollars and should be shut down, in addition to the inhumane conditions.
Great, thank you so much. And so with that, if there are no more final questions, we want to thank folks for being on. And we'll go to the next slide.
Cricket's got another one.
Cricket's got, go ahead, real quick.
Okay. Let's see, who was it that was speaking first? Oh, Salma. You gave I'm one of the people that said slow down because.
I'm so sorry.
No, I completely understand. I really do. But you gave a lot of data, a lot of information at the beginning. Is there some way we could get a copy? You probably have at least a lot of it in writing somewhere. And I think when talking to people, talking to the congressional offices, or even to get other people to sign the letter, that would be helpful.
Absolutely.
To have that. I didn't get any of it. It was too fast for me.
Got it. Yeah, I will be sure to share my notes so that they're circulated along with the recording.
I'm really grateful, because it's you feel kind of stupid sometimes. You're talking to somebody and they say, well, you know, what does this mean? And you're going, well, they said it was important. You know, it's helpful to know a little bit that you can put out, like, you know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Aside from the fact that it's cruel and unusual. I mean, but that almost is like such a stock phrase that it's helpful sometimes to have, like, your numbers. There are all these empty beds. Why are we paying people to keep empty beds? You know, that's something that might move somebody. Yeah.
Great question. All right, so with that, we are going to just give you all a quick reminder. We do have an upcoming training next Wednesday. Ashley talked about proper terms and for campaigns, so you can learn more about those at this training, Wednesday, October 13, 5:30 to 6:30. It's going to be on power mapping and campaign planning. So feel free to sign up at aclunc.org/be-the-change. And with that, we'll go to the final slide and we'll go ahead and close out for the night. Again, thank you all so much. You can email us at changemakers@aclunc.org with any additional questions that you have for us, and we'll be sure to follow up. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.